Hello everyone. Today I will just want to answer one question which was asked by Szymon Ruta in one of the previous videos. It was the question is about splitting the code into multiple files and what are the rules around that. So to answer this question, let me just show you this code. We have class tennis game 1. That was the name it was like given by the refactoring kata, and I assume this is public API, so I simulate the situation where I'm not changing this public API. And then I have a module. This is a typical pattern, by the way, where I'm hiding all the implementation details behind some modules. So in module tennis, I have several classes. So the nice thing about keeping it in one file, which is 300 lines of code, but it contains several classes, is that, for example, in my IDE, which is RubyMine, I can look at this view and I can see everything here. So this is not the main reason to do that, but it's a nice side effect of having this in one file. I can just look at whatever classes are in there or whatever methods are in there. So I can, instead of looking at the implementation details, I can think about this module by looking at those smaller objects. But the actual thing and the main reason is that I consider tennis game 1 an actual object, an actual unit or an actual component. I know this terminology may be like sometimes very similar, sometimes very different, and I will try to cover this terminology nuances in some other videos. But for now, let's just notice that from the perspective of the outside system, this is one object. This is one component. And everything else is just details. So it is all is a class, but for me it's even too much to call it a class. It's just some kind of small class, but this is part of the bigger object, right? So that's the important thing. This is for me the object. And obviously we can ask the question, okay, so what is the scope of the object? So it's not always easy to answer, but if you are following stuff like domain-driven design or CQRS, then the kind of units are more clear. And that's what I like the concepts from domain-driven design and from CQRS, because, for example, from CQRS, we know that a unit is a read model. At least that's my understanding and my interpretation of this. And, for example, an aggregate is an object as well. So tennis game 1 is kind of an aggregate overall. It's an aggregate root as a class because it references other objects. There are some value objects and so on. So this is a part of it actually hides a whole tree of objects, right? So that would be typical aggregate. But I don't really need to label what it is, but just think about this stuff like objects. Another name, another term for that would be actors. But just to cut the scope of this for this question, so I like to keep the implementation of one object in one file. There's no need to go for everything else. We are temporarily at kind of two implementations. If you're following this series, you know where we are. We are trying to implement this like or alternative implementation, so there is actually more content needed. Maybe later, if I see that there is some code to be extracted, maybe I will extract to some files and then reuse require to have this all to work all together. But most likely I will just think, okay, maybe there's a code smell that within one object I have a temptation to extract more files. So I would maybe try to think about at the design level what's wrong with this object. And this is my answer for this kind of code. For example, obviously for typical Rails MVC code, it's a different answer because there are conventions around keeping controllers in one directory, and then each controller is a separate file. And I actually have opinions on that too, and I don't think this was, as a convention it's okay, but usually you want to customize it. And there is another extreme version of this because I came from Java to Ruby like 15 years ago. I know that in Java it was like one class per one file. And one of the first things that I welcomed in the Ruby world was the ability to have more classes as part of one file. I like the idea of one file, one object. So I followed this pattern. I hope it answered your question, Szymon. Thank you. And for everyone else, feel free to ask me questions in the YouTube comments or Facebook comments. I look at them and I will try to cover them in the next videos. So thank you.